Yeah, I think there's a lot of people that think that simulation has to be fancy and in a big environment with cameras in a separate room where somebody is there. And I think simulation can take a lot of different ways. And when we're talking to the actual EMT or AEMT or paramedic on the street, we're not talking about just big simulation centers. We could be talking about squad training, training in the in your classroom to get your certification, and maybe just interesting stuff you can do along the way.
Yeah, people think of when they go to an EMT class, and one of the first things that they learn to do with each other is patient assessment. They do vital signs on each other and ask the sample questions and those types of rudimentary things. And that is simulation. That's a form of simulation. And I think that it's kind of lost on folks, kind of those pieces and parts.
Well, I think that's a great segue in because in your 7 things, the first one is skills training, and that we do have mannequins and we're using those for skills. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so skills training is a really big part of simulation, and skills training can take a lot of different forms in simulation. But the vast majority of people, when they do skills training, do what's called low fidelity. And I think it's important to talk just a little bit about fidelity when you talk about simulation. You've got low fidelity to high fidelity, and fidelity meaning, according to the SSIH and the Society for Simulation and Healthcare, that defines it, is that fidelity is simulation that's meaning the degree to which the simulation replicates a real event or workplace, including the environment, the psychological, the physical areas of what we do. So a skills training, say Mr. Big Head, and we'll take airway as an example. So you use your Mr. Big Head airway trainer and you lay out all your pieces of your airway equipment. And then you sit and you just kind of walk through the steps of putting in an airway. There's no time stretch. There's no pressure to do something. It's really just kind of going through that rudimentary skills. And that's probably the lowest fidelity in what we talk about with skills training. Or like I said, vital signs. You use a partner and you put the blood pressure cuff on and you deal with those types of things. And there's probably immediate feedback right there. And that's skills training. Now, in the National Registry practicals for first responder and EMTs, you have stations, even a paramedic, that are basically skills stations, and you go through those things. There's no feedback, there's no anything, but that's still considered low fidelity skills training for that. And so that's the first kind of piece, and I think most people are familiar with that. And you use it to learn techniques or new piece of equipment that comes into your squad or your ambulance service or your rescue team or whatever, to get familiar with that equipment. And there's nothing really built around it except for pressing the buttons or putting in an oral airway or learning how to use an eye gel or something like that.
As you go from the individual mannequin and the individual skills training we're talking about here, it looks to me, when I was looking over the next things you wrote, we're now upping the ante quite a bit into simulation, talking about problem solving and clinical reasoning and judgment. Before we go into those, is there something people are saying? Well, it's plastic. It doesn't seem real. What would you say to the EMT or the AEMT or the paramedic that's got a program or an agency that's teaching using simulation? How would you say to the person to go there, how do you interact? How do you get the most out of simulation training?
I think the biggest thing is that there's a depending on the level that you're using or the fidelity that you're trying to go for, as an educator first, you have to really understand like the pyramids of education. So if you look at Maslow's hierarchy, for instance, or something like that, you have that in simulation. The very bottom of that thing, you got to accommodate those needs. It really is that skills piece. And then after that, then you start to get into the application pieces. And then very at the top, you have the critical thinking part. And you can build your simulation in that same way. So what we're talking about here is really the very bottom, the foundational area of simulation. And what I think people get nervous about simulation is they think they have to have a scenario, and they think that they're constantly being tested. They're using simulation almost as a negative reinforcement tool, Dan. So that's the thing that concerns me rather than an educational process. This should be, it should have a level of fun. It should have a level of engagement that's more than, just sitting there saying, oh, you got that. No, you didn't get this. Oh, you got that. You didn't get this. I've never been a fan of checklists and skills stuff because, in the real world, when we talk about, we'll get to later in the simulation, when you apply critical thinking, hey, there may be times where you can't follow that checklist. You've got to be smart enough to be able to say, hey, I know what the basic principles are, and I got to apply them in this way because it's the only way that makes sense. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on. We talk about more of the high fidelity and the critical thinking stuff.